Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It is a street corner like any other, baked in the lazy warmth of a late June morning. The air in Sarajevo is thick with the smell of coffee and charcoal smoke. The gentle hum of a city going about its business. Along the Apol Quay, which follows the lazy curve of the Miljacka River, people have gathered. They are here to see a spectacle, a procession of empire. A motorcade is scheduled to pass, carrying a man who represents a distant, often resented power. He is the heir to the throne of the vast, creaking Austro-Hungarian Empire. His name is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. For most onlookers, this is a curiosity, a momentary diversion. But for a handful of young men scattered in the crowd, it is the culmination of a vow. They are assassins, clutching crude bombs and loaded pistols in their sweaty palms, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and patriotic fervor. One of them, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, has already convinced himself that the day is a failure. An earlier attempt on the Archduke's life that morning had gone wrong, a bomb bouncing off the royal car and exploding beneath another, wounding several people but leaving its primary target unscathed. The motorcade had sped off. The Archduke was safe, and the conspiracy seemed to be in tatters. So Princip lingers. He wanders away from the river, down a side street named for the Archduke's own great-uncle, Franz Joseph. He stops in front of a delicatessen, perhaps to buy a sandwich, perhaps just to gather his thoughts, his mind reeling with the bitter taste of defeat. He is a boy consumed by ideology and ravaged by tuberculosis, a young man who believes his life is already forfeit and is determined to spend it on a single meaningful act. That act now seems impossible. The opportunity is gone. And then the sound of an engine. An open-topped Graf and stiffed automobile, the color of a dark green beetle, slowly turns into his street. It is a mistake, a wrong turn. The driver, realizing his error, puts his foot on the brake. The gears grind as he tries to reverse. The car stalls. It shudders to a halt less than 5 feet from where Gavrilo Princip is standing. And inside, looking directly at him, is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. History in that moment holds its breath. The machinery of the 20th century, with all its impending horrors, its trenches and its poison gas, its fallen empires and its redrawn maps, its tens of millions dead, all comes to a dead stop on this quiet side street, waiting for the decision of a boy with a pistol in his pocket. It is a moment of such staggering, improbable coincidence that it feels like the work of a malevolent playwright. This is not simply the story of a political murder. It is the story of the single most consequential crime in modern history. The 2 gunshots fired on that corner would become the starting pistol for a global race to annihilation. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we are not dissecting a whodunit, for we know who pulled the trigger. We are dissecting the how and the why. We are examining the anatomy of a catalyst. We will explore the complex web of nationalist fury, imperial ambition, and Byzantine secret societies that loaded the gun. We will trace the series of blunders, miscalculations, and sheer dumb luck that place the victim squarely in the assassin's sights. And we will follow the dominoes as they fell, one by one, in the 37 days that followed, turning a murder into a world war. This is the story of how 2 bullets killed more than 15 million people. To understand the shots fired in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, we must first understand the world that produced them. It was a world of empires, but empires that were beginning to fray at the seams. At the heart of our story is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a sprawling multi-ethnic entity ruled by the ancient House of Habsburg. It was a mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, and Serbs, among others, all held together by a fragile allegiance to the aging emperor, Franz Joseph. But beneath this imperial veneer, the fires of nationalism were burning. In the 19th century, the idea that a people, defined by a common language, culture, and history, had the right to self-determination had swept across Europe. It had created new nations like Germany and Italy, and now it was threatening to tear Austria-Hungary apart. The most volatile region of this volatile empire was the Balkans, a peninsula often called the powder keg of Europe. For centuries, much of the area had been under the thumb of another decaying empire, the Ottoman Turks. But as the Ottomans weakened, new nations had fought their way to independence. Greece, Bulgaria, and crucially, Serbia. Serbia, a small Slavic kingdom, dreamed big. It saw itself as the nucleus of a future great state, a Yugoslavia, a land of the South Slavs, that would unite all Slavic peoples in the region. This ambition put it on a direct collision course with Austria-Hungary, which had its own large South Slav populations, particularly in the province of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia, a territory it had administered for 30 years, but which was still technically Ottoman. For the nationalists in neighboring Serbia, this was an outrage. Bosnia was home to a huge population of ethnic Serbs. Its capital, Sarajevo, was a city they felt belonged in the Slavic world, not under the German-speaking Habsburgs. The annexation was seen as a profound humiliation and an existential threat to the dream of a unified Yugoslavia. It lit a fuse of resentment that would smolder for 6 years. It was in this atmosphere of rage and impotence that secret societies began to flourish. These were not mere political clubs. They were clandestine paramilitary organizations dedicated to the cause of Serbian unification by any means necessary, including terrorism. The most formidable of these was a group called Ujedinjenje ILISMRT, which translates to unification or death. History would know it by its more menacing moniker. The Black Hand. The Black Hand was not a collection of fringe radicals. Its tendrils reached into the highest levels of the Serbian state. Its members were army officers, government officials, and court functionaries. They were men who wore the king's uniform by day and plotted political violence by night. At its head was Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijevic, better known by his code name, API's the Bull. API's was the chief of Serbian military intelligence. He was a master of conspiracy, a fervent nationalist who had been involved in the bloody palace coup of 1903 that had installed a new dynasty on the Serbian throne. For API's and the Black Hand, Austria-Hungary was the implacable enemy, and any action taken against it was not only justified, but holy. They began to train guerrillas, to run agents across the border into Bosnia, to look for a way to strike a blow that Vienna would feel. They were waiting for an opportunity, and in the spring of 1914, they found one. The target would be Archduke Franz Ferdinand. To understand why he was chosen, we must dispense with the caricature of the Archduke as a tyrant. The reality was far more complex, and in that complexity lies a deep and tragic irony. Franz Ferdinand was, by most accounts, not a particularly likable man. He was aloof, possessed a famously short temper, and held many of the prejudices common to his class and time. His personal passion was hunting, a pursuit he engaged in with an almost pathological fervor. slaughtering hundreds of thousands of animals over his lifetime. He was a man of contradictions, a devout Catholic and a devoted family man who could also be remarkably callous. But in the realm of politics, he was far from a simple-minded imperial hawk. In fact, he was one of the leading voices for peace and reform within the Austro-Hungarian government. He viewed the ruling elites of Hungary with suspicion and was deeply concerned by the rising tide of nationalism that threatened to drown the empire. His solution was radical for its time. He advocated for a plan known as trialism, which would transform the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary into a triple monarchy, creating a third, semi-autonomous Slavic entity within the empire, with its capital likely in Zagreb. He believed that by giving the South Slavs greater political power and recognition, he could placate their nationalist desires and secure their loyalty to the Habsburg crown. This, he reasoned, would neutralize the threat from Serbia and preserve the empire for a new generation. And here is the irony. This very vision of a reformed, federalized empire made him the single greatest threat to the dream of the Black Hand. A contented Slavic population within Austria-Hungary would have no desire to join a greater Serbia. Franz Ferdinand's policy of conciliation was more dangerous to their cause than a policy of oppression. A tyrant can inspire a revolution, but a reformer can kill it in the cradle. By offering the Slavs a place at the imperial table, he threatened to steal the very people the Serbian nationalists claimed to be liberating. For this reason, in the eyes of men like APIs, the Archduke had to die. His moderation was his death sentence. Adding to the personal dimension of the tragedy was his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. Theirs was a genuine love story in an era of arranged royal marriages. Sophie was a Czech countess, but in the rigid caste system of the Habsburg court, she was not considered of equal birth to an heir to the throne. Emperor Franz Joseph only consented to the marriage after Franz Ferdinand agreed to a morganatic oath, renouncing any right of succession for his future children, and agreeing that his wife would never share his rank, title, or privileges. She could not be called Her Imperial and Royal Highness. She could not sit in the royal box at the theater or ride in the main royal carriage in a procession. She was forever the lesser. It was a constant, public humiliation that Franz Ferdinand deeply resented. But there was one exception. When he was acting in a military capacity as Inspector General of the Armed Forces, his wife was permitted to appear at his side with the honors befitting her station. And it was in this capacity that he was scheduled to visit Bosnia in June of 1914 to observe military maneuvers. The visit would culminate in a formal procession through the capital, Sarajevo. It would be a rare opportunity for Sophie to be seen for what she was, the respected and beloved wife of the heir to the throne. It was an anniversary gift to her, a small piece of pageantry to make up for a decade of slights. Their wedding anniversary was June 28th. The men who would kill Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were not seasoned soldiers or professional assassins. They were boys, students, consumed by an ideology they barely understood. They were members of a radical student group called Mlada Bosna, or Young Bosnia. They were Serbs, but they were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, living in a land they considered occupied territory. Their nationalism was a heady, romantic brew of poetry, philosophy, and revolutionary zeal. They saw themselves as martyrs for a sacred cause, willing to die to free their people. The key figure among them was Gavrilo Princip. Born into a poor rural family, he was small and frail. his health already being eaten away by the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. But within him burned a quiet, intense fire. He was a voracious reader, and in Belgrade, where he was studying, he fell in with the city's fervent nationalist circles. In early 1914, Princip and two of his fellow Bosnian Serb students, Nedeljko Kabrinovac and Trifko Grabas, learned of the Archduke's planned visit to Sarajevo. They saw their chance. This was the ultimate symbolic act. To kill the heir, the very embodiment of the empire, in the heart of the province they believed he was oppressing. They made a pact to assassinate him. But they were amateurs. They had no weapons, no training, no plan. What they did have were connections. Through a series of intermediaries, their desire to act reached the ears of the Black Hand. Colonel Apis saw the potential. Here were three young, expendable Bosnians, Austro-Hungarian subjects, who could carry out the deed. Their local status would make it harder to trace the plot back to Belgrade. If successful, the assassination would destabilize the region and provoke a crisis that Serbia, with the backing of its mighty Slavic patron, Russia, might be able to exploit. Apis and the Black Hand decided to provide the tools for the job. Princip, Kabrinovac, and Grabas were given 4 FN Model 1910 semi-automatic pistols, 6 small, Serbian-made bombs, and cyanide capsules to swallow upon completion of their mission. They were given a cursory lesson in how to use the weapons at a park in Belgrade. A Black Hand agent then arranged for them to be smuggled along with their arsenal across the Drina River and into Bosnia, using a clandestine network of safe houses and sympathetic border guards. Once in Sarajevo, they linked up with a local cell of conspirators who would help them prepare. In the end, the team of assassins grew to 7 men, all stationed at various points along the Archduke's announced motorcade route, on the morning of June 28. The day itself, Sunday, June 28, 1914, was a date of profound significance for Serbs. It was Vidovdan, or Saint Vitus's Day. On this day in 1389, the medieval Serbian kingdom had fought the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Kosovo. Though the battle's outcome was technically inconclusive, it marked the beginning of centuries of Ottoman rule and became the central mythic event in the Serbian national consciousness, a day of glorious, heroic defeat and a symbol of the long struggle for freedom. To assassinate the Habsburg heir on this day of national mourning and pride was an act saturated with symbolism. It was intended as a declaration that one oppressor had been thrown off, and the other would be too. The Archduke and his wife arrived in Sarajevo by train shortly before 10 in the morning. They were met by General Oskar Potoric, the military governor of Bosnia. From the start, the security arrangements were shockingly lax. The route had been published in newspapers for weeks. Potoric, eager to show that the Bosnian people welcomed their Habsburg rulers, had intentionally minimized the police and military presence along the streets. He wanted the crowds to have a clear view. The motorcade consisted of 6 cars. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were in the second, a convertible with its top folded down to allow them to wave to the public. They sat with General Potoric. The mayor of Sarajevo was in the lead car. The small group of 7 assassins took their positions along the main thoroughfare, the Apple Quay. As the motorcade moved along the river, the first 2 assassins it passed lost their nerve and failed to act. Then it approached the position of Nedeljko Kabrinovac. He was standing near the Kumuraja bridge. As the Archduke's car drew near, Kabrinovac armed his bomb by striking its percussion cap against a lamppost and hurled it. The driver saw the dark object flying through the air and instinctively accelerated. The The bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible top of the Archduke's car, rolled into the street, and exploded under the wheels of the third car in the procession. The blast was loud, but not devastating. It wounded 2 officers in the third car, Colonel Erich von Marizzi and Count Alexander von Bußwaldeck, along with a number of bystanders. Smoke filled the air. For a moment there was chaos. Gavrilo, believing he had succeeded, swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into the Miljacka River to drown himself. But the mission was a failure in every respect. The cyanide was old and only made him vomit, and the river was only a few inches deep due to the dry summer weather. He was quickly dragged from the riverbed and taken into custody by the police. The motorcade, meanwhile, had sped away from the scene of the explosion. The Archduke was unharmed, as was Sophie. They continued to their scheduled reception at City Hall. The other assassins along the route, including Gavrilo Princip, heard the explosion and the subsequent confusion. They assumed the plan had either succeeded or failed completely. Most of them simply melted back into the crowd and began to walk away. The conspiracy appeared to be over. Upon arriving at City Hall, Franz Ferdinand was visibly furious. He interrupted the mayor's prepared welcome speech, exclaiming, "Mr. Mayor, I come here on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs. It is outrageous." After regaining his composure, he proceeded with the official reception. But the day's plans had been disrupted. A decision had to be made about what to do next. The Archduke was adamant about one thing. He wanted to visit the hospital to check on Colonel von Marizzi, who had been wounded by the bomb. This was a fateful choice. General Potorik agreed, but insisted that the route be changed to avoid the crowded city center. The plan was to drive straight back along the Apple Quay, the same wide boulevard they had come down, to reach the hospital on the outskirts of town. This crucial change of plan, however, was not clearly communicated to the drivers. The driver of the first car, and crucially, the driver of Franz Ferdinand's car, Leopold Loka, were not explicitly told about the new route. They were still operating under the original itinerary, which included a right turn off the Apple Quay and into the narrow streets of the old town. And so, as the motorcade left City Hall, a fatal miscommunication was set in motion. The first car, carrying the mayor, reached the intersection at the Latin Bridge and, following the original plan, made a right turn onto Franz Joseph Street. Leopold Loka, driving the Archduke's car, dutifully followed the car in front of him, turning right off the Apple Quay. General Potorik, sitting in the car with the royal couple, immediately realized the mistake. He shouted at the driver, "What is this? This is the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." Loka slammed on the brakes. The large Graf and Stift car had no reverse gear in the modern sense. To back up, the engine had to be stopped, and the transmission manually shifted. The car stalled, coming to a dead halt right at the corner, its engine silent. It was at this precise location, at this exact moment, that Gavrilo Princip was standing. After the morning's failed bombing, he had wandered despondently to Moritz Schiller's delicatessen, just a few yards down Franz Joseph Street. He had given up, and then, fate or chance or some inexplicable confluence of events delivered his target directly to him. The heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was now a stationary target, less than 5 feet away. Princip did not hesitate. He stepped forward from the curb, drew his 9mm FN Model 1910 pistol, and fired 2 shots in quick succession. He would later claim that he had intended to kill General Potorik with the second shot, but the chaos of the moment made precision impossible. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second bullet hit the Duchess. It was an unlucky shot of the highest order. It passed through the side of the car, entered her abdomen, and severed her stomach artery. For a moment, no one seemed to realize what had happened. Sophie slumped over, her head falling into her husband's lap. The Archduke, still sitting upright, initially thought she had fainted from the shock. He was heard to say, so Farrell, don't die. Stay alive for our children." He turned to an aide, and a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Count Herrick, who was standing on the car's running board, asked if he was in pain. The Archduke replied, "It is nothing," several times before his head slumped forward and he lost consciousness. Sophie was likely dead before the car reached the governor's residence. Franz Ferdinand died minutes later. His last words had been for his wife and his children. Back on the street corner, chaos erupted. Princip was immediately set upon by the crowd and arrested by police. He attempted to swallow his cyanide, but it was knocked from his hand. He tried to turn the gun on himself, but it was wrestled away. The crime that would change the world was over in a matter of seconds. The news from Sarajevo spread across Europe like a shockwave. In the capitals of the great powers, there was condemnation and official mourning. But beneath the surface, the gears of diplomacy and military planning began to turn. Nowhere was the reaction more intense than in Vienna. For years, a powerful faction within the Austro-Hungarian government, led by the chief of the General Staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf, had been agitating for a preventive war against Serbia. They saw the small Slavic kingdom as an intolerable threat to the empire's stability and believed it needed to be crushed. The assassination of the heir to the throne provided them with the perfect pretext. This was no longer a matter of policy, it was a matter of honor. The murder was seen not just as a terrorist act, but as a direct assault on the Habsburg dynasty and the integrity of the empire itself. However, Austria-Hungary could not act alone. A war with Serbia would almost certainly bring Serbia's great protector, Russia, into the conflict, and a war with Russia would mean a war with Russia's ally, France. To risk such a widespread conflagration, Vienna needed the unconditional support of its most powerful ally, Germany. On July 5th, an Austrian envoy was sent to Berlin to consult with the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser and his government, motivated by a mix of loyalty to their ally, a fear of growing Russian power, and a belief that a short, sharp war was inevitable, and perhaps even desirable, gave Austria-Hungary the assurance it sought. They issued what became known as the blank check, promising to back Austria-Hungary in whatever course of action it chose to take against Serbia, even if it meant war with Russia. Emboldened by Germany's unwavering support, the Austrian government spent the next few weeks carefully crafting a diplomatic trap. They wanted to present Serbia with a list of demands so harsh and humiliating that it would be impossible for any sovereign nation to accept them completely. Rejection would provide the clear justification for war. On July 23rd, nearly a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Belgrade. The document contained 10 demands. They included the suppression of all anti-Austrian publications, the dissolution of nationalist organizations, like the Black Hand, the dismissal of specific officials from the Serbian government and military, and, most provocatively, a demand that Austro-Hungarian officials be allowed to participate in the investigation and judicial proceedings on Serbian soil. This last point, point 6, was a direct infringement on Serbian sovereignty. The world watched as Serbia weighed its response. The deadline was 48 hours. With the advice of Russia, the Serbian government crafted a masterful reply. They accepted nearly all of the ultimatum's terms. They agreed to 9 of the 10 points, or at least accepted them in principle. They rejected only the single point that most directly compromised their independence: the participation of Austrian officials in their internal judicial process. They suggested that this specific point could be referred to the International Court at The Hague for arbitration. It was a remarkably conciliatory response, one that European leaders, like the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, believed should have been enough to avert war. The German Kaiser himself, upon reading the Serbian reply, declared that every reason for war drops away. But the war party in Vienna was not interested in a diplomatic victory. They were interested in war. They seized upon Serbia's partial rejection of Point 6 as a full rejection of the ultimatum. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia. The first shells of the Great War began to fall on Belgrade the next day. The catalyst had now triggered the chain reaction. The intricate system of alliances that had been designed to keep the peace in Europe now became a doomsday machine, dragging the continent into a war that no single nation truly wanted, but which none seemed able to prevent. Russia, seeing itself as the leader of the Slavic world, and unwilling to suffer the humiliation of abandoning its Serbian client, ordered a partial mobilization of its massive army against Austria-Hungary. When Austria's ally, Germany, demanded that Russia stand down, the Tsar refused. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. Germany knew that a war with Russia meant a war with France due to the Franco-Russian alliance. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, called for a rapid knockout blow against France by sweeping through neutral Belgium before turning the full might of its army eastward to deal with the slow-mobilizing Russians. And so, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The next day, German troops crossed the border into Belgium. For Great Britain, the invasion of neutral Belgium was the final straw. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality by treaty, and could not stand by while Germany overran the small nation to gain a strategic advantage. On August 4, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The dominoes had all fallen. A Balkan crisis had become a European war. Within weeks, it would become a world war, drawing in empires, colonies, and nations from every corner of the globe. The fate of the assassins themselves became a footnote to the global catastrophe they had unleashed. Because they were all under the age of 20, they were spared the death penalty under Habsburg law. Gavrilo Princip was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. He was imprisoned in the harsh conditions of the Terezin fortress in what is now the Czech Republic, ravaged by tuberculosis, which ate away at his bones and led to the amputation of his arm. He died in his cell in April of 1918, just a few months before the end of the war he had started. He never lived to see the creation of Yugoslavia, the state he had killed and died for. The other young conspirators also died in prison from malnutrition and disease. The older plotters, the members of the Black Hand who had armed the boys, faced a different kind of justice. Colonel EP89, the powerful intelligence chief, was arrested by the Serbian government in exile during the war, tried on trumped-up charges of treason, and executed by firing squad in 1917. His own government, the one he had sought to expand, silenced him forever. In the end, what is the true anatomy of this catalyst? It is a complex structure built from the bones of history, politics, and human fallibility, One part of its anatomy is the deep, systemic pressure of nationalism and imperialism, two opposing forces grinding against each other in the fragile landscape of the Balkans. It is the story of a multi-ethnic empire struggling to contain the modern urge for self-determination, a struggle that was destined for a violent resolution. Another part is the anatomy of conspiracy, the shadowy world of the Black Hand, where patriotic fervor blurred into a fanaticism that saw assassination as a legitimate tool of statecraft. It shows how a small group of determined men, operating from the highest levels of a government, could manipulate the passions of idealistic youths to serve their own geopolitical ends. But perhaps the most crucial part of this anatomy, the part that makes the story so compelling and so terrifying, is the role of pure, unadulterated chance. The story of June 28, 1914, is a litany of small accidents and coincidences that, when strung together, altered the course of human history. A security detail that was criminally negligent, a bomb that was thrown just a second too late, an assassin who failed to act, another who failed to kill himself, a decision by the Archduke to visit a wounded officer out of a sense of duty, a crucial failure to communicate a change of route to a driver, a wrong turn down a random side street, and a car that stalled at the exact spot where a dejected 19-year-old boy was standing, having given up all hope. If any one of these things had happened differently, the day would have ended with a minor diplomatic incident instead of a double murder. There would have been angry telegrams, but no ultimatum, no declarations of war, no trenches. The world of 1914, with all its deep-seated tensions, might have found another path, but it did not. The system of alliances, the military timetables, the imperial rivalries, all of this was the tinder. The assassination was the spark. The crime itself was localized, almost intimate. 2 shots from a pistol on a city street. But the crime scene was, in reality, the entire continent of Europe, a place so tightly wound with treaties and tensions that a single pull on one thread was enough to unravel it all. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not the sole cause of the First World War, but it was the trigger, the improbable and catastrophic event that allowed all the other latent causes to explode into open conflict. It demonstrates how history is not just the product of grand, impersonal forces, but also of small human moments of choice and chance. It is a story of political ideologies, but it is also a story of a husband's love for his wife, a boy's fatalistic despair, and a driver's simple mistake. And in that intersection of the epic and the mundane lies the enduring horror of the crime in Sarajevo. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the vast complex edifice of global peace can be brought crashing down by the simplest of acts. All it took was 2 bullets, fired on a street corner, to end one world and begin another. The echo of Gavrilo Princip's pistol is a sound that has never truly faded. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.